Hollywood's golden age lurked a deadly addiction that claimed countless lives. These legendary screen sirens projected elegance on camera, but off-screen, their lives were consumed by a habit that would eventually destroy them. Which iconic actress smoked an astonishing 4 packs a day while filming her most famous role? Number 1. Bette Davis. Bette Davis wasn't just Hollywood royalty. She was a force of nature who commanded every frame she occupied with those hypnotic eyes and razor-sharp delivery. With 2 Academy Awards and a career spanning 6 decades, Davis redefined what it meant to be a leading lady. But behind that commanding presence was a woman completely enslaved to nicotine, a habit that ultimately became as iconic as her performances. Davis didn't just smoke, she transformed it into performance art, wielding cigarettes like weapons in classics like All About Eve and Now Voyager. That famous scene where she lights 2 cigarettes? It wasn't just acting. It was addiction masquerading as romance. At her peak, Davis consumed 3 to 4 packs daily, often chain-smoking through interviews, rehearsals, and even meals. Her daughter once revealed, "Mother measured her life in cigarettes, not minutes." When doctors warned that smoking was destroying her health, Davis reportedly snapped, "I'd rather have a cigarette than breath." This wasn't hyperbole. When a stroke left her partially paralyzed in 1983, nurses found her attempting to light cigarettes with her one functioning hand mere hours after regaining consciousness. Perhaps most chilling was Davis's fatalistic acceptance. When asked if she regretted smoking, she famously quipped, "If I hadn't smoked, I would have eaten everything in sight. I've chosen my poison." That poison ultimately contributed to her breast cancer, stroke, and the emphysema that left her gasping for breath in her final years. When she died in 1989, her body had endured over 1.5 million cigarettes. Her addiction wasn't just a habit. It was a defining characteristic of a woman who lived and died on her own defiant terms. Number 2. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford clawed her way to the pinnacle of Hollywood stardom through sheer force of will. With her sharp features and penetrating gaze, she embodied sophistication and power in classics like Mildred Pierce and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. But the woman who maintained meticulous control over her image harbored a destructive relationship with cigarettes that undermined everything she built. Crawford's addiction began in the silent era, when smoking signaled liberation for women. By the 1930s, she was burning through 3 packs daily while maintaining a terrifying work ethic. Photographers were instructed never to capture her in the act of lighting up, only holding cigarettes elegantly. The reality was far messier. Crawford's fingers were permanently yellowed, and she often burned holes in costumes worth thousands. Her obsession with cleanliness made her smoking even more paradoxical. The same woman who reportedly scrubbed her hands with hot water and rubbing alcohol up to 20 times daily thought nothing of filling her lungs with tar and nicotine. When her 4th husband, Pepsi CEO Alfred Steele, begged her to quit, she coldly replied, "I'd sooner divorce you than my cigarettes." By the 1960s, heavy smoking had deepened her voice to a rasp and accentuated the harshness that had replaced her youthful beauty. Studio makeup artists worked overtime, concealing the telltale smoker's lines around her mouth. When cancer finally claimed her in 1977, few were surprised. The woman who once said, "I need a cigarette to complete a sentence," had finally been silenced by the very habit that had been her constant companion. Even on her deathbed, Crawford allegedly asked for one final cigarette, a fitting end for Hollywood's ultimate survivor. Number 3. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich didn't just smoke cigarettes. She weaponized them, transforming a deadly habit into an extension of her mythical allure. With her androgynous appeal and smoldering gaze, Dietrich revolutionized Hollywood's concept of femininity in classics like The Blue Angel and Morocco. But the smoke that swirled around her iconic image was slowly killing the woman behind the plow. Legend. Dietrich's affair with nicotine began in Berlin cabaret clubs, where cigarettes were as essential to the atmosphere as the music. By the time she conquered Hollywood, smoking had become integral to her persona, a prop as carefully deployed as her lighting or camera angles. Director Joseph von Sternberg once revealed, "Marlene could communicate more with cigarette smoke than most actresses could with Shakespearean monologues." Her habit was relentless. Studio hands reported that Dietrich would light a fresh cigarette from the burning end of the previous one, a chain that remained unbroken for hours. She preferred custom-made French cigarettes, refusing American brands as too harsh for a lady, though she would consume up to 60 of her preferred poison daily. The most disturbing aspect? Dietrich maintained her habit well into her 80 seconds, even after suffering 4 heart attacks that doctors directly attributed to smoking. When friends begged her to quit, she dismissed them with, "Darling, I've survived Hitler, Hollywood, and fashion. A little cigarette won't kill me." But it did contribute to the circulatory problems that confined her to her Paris apartment in her final years. When Dietrich died in 1992, her legendary voice had been reduced to a gravelly whisper, her famous cheekbones sunken by years of inhaling poison in the pursuit of mystique. The blue smoke that helped craft her legend had ultimately consumed her. Number 4. Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn projected an image of unstoppable health and vitality, with her athletic build and energetic performances in classics like The African Queen and The Philadelphia Story. She seemed immune to human frailty. This makes her 6-decade addiction to cigarettes all the more shocking. The woman who embodied American fortitude was secretly a slave to nicotine. Hepburn began smoking at 16 and quickly escalated to 3 packs daily. Her distinctive voice, once melodic in her early films, progressively developed the trembling quality that became her trademark. What audiences perceived as character was actually the permanent damage of tobacco. More disturbing was how Hepburn incorporated smoking into her feminist persona, positioning it as a declaration of independence rather than acknowledging her dependence. On set, Hepburn was infamous for smoking through rehearsals, lighting up between takes, even smoking while performing her own stunts. Director John Huston recalled, "Kate would finish a physically grueling scene, gasping for breath, then immediately light a cigarette. It was like watching someone punch themselves in the face after running a marathon." By her 70 seconds, Hepburn's hands visibly shook from a neurological condition exacerbated by nicotine, forcing directors to shoot around her tremors. When urged to quit by doctors after a health scare in 1984, she allegedly retorted, "I'd rather die sooner as myself than live longer as someone I don't recognize." The ultimate irony. This symbol of American vitality spent her final years battling Parkinson-like symptoms intensified by decades of smoking. When she died in 2003 at 96, medical experts were stunned she had survived so long given her tobacco consumption. Her remarkable longevity wasn't a victory over cigarettes, but a testament to what her extraordinary constitution might have achieved without them. Number 5. Lauren Bacall. Lauren Bacall burst onto screens at just 19, with that unforgettable line in To Have and Have Not. "You know how to whistle, don't you? Just put your lips together and blow." That husky voice and smoldering gaze launched her into instant stardom. What audiences didn't realize was that Bacall's trademark vocal delivery wasn't natural. It was the result of relentless smoking that began before she was even a teenager. Director Howard Hawks initially discovered Bacall on a magazine cover, but worried her voice was too high-pitched for a femme fatale. His solution? Have her drive into the Hollywood Hills each day, smoking constantly while reading aloud for hours until her vocal cords were permanently altered. What seemed like sultry confidence was actually the sound of damaged tissue. Bacall's relationship with cigarettes became inseparable from her screen identity. In her nearly 60-year career, she appeared in countless scenes with a cigarette dangling from her lips or elegantly poised between her fingers. Off-screen, the addiction was even more intense. During her marriage to fellow smoker Humphrey Bogart, friends joked that the Bogarts communicated through smoke signals, sometimes consuming 5 packs between them daily. The cruel twist came when Bogart died of throat cancer in 1957. His body ravaged by the same habit Bacall continued to embrace. Despite witnessing her husband's agonizing death, she continued smoking for decades afterward, later admitting, "After Bogey died, cigarettes became my most reliable companions." Only in her 60 seconds, after a minor heart attack that doctors attributed directly to smoking, did Bacall finally quit. The damage, however, was permanent. That legendary voice became increasingly raspy, a constant reminder of the addiction that gave her career its signature sound, while simultaneously undermining her health for over 50 years. Number 6. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth wasn't just famous, she was iconic. The definitive bombshell whose image was literally pasted onto the first atomic bomb tested at Bikini Atoll. Her performance in Gilda, with that famous hair toss, created a collective gasp in theaters worldwide. But the woman-born Margarita Cancino was consuming herself from the inside with a tobacco habit that would contribute to her tragic downfall. Hayworth started smoking at 12, introduced to cigarettes by dancers on the Mexican vaudeville circuit, where her father forced her to perform. By the time Columbia Pictures transformed her into Rita Hayworth, smoking had become her coping mechanism for the pressures of stardom. Between takes on Gilda, she would chain smoke in her dressing room, sometimes burning through 3 cigarettes in the brief minutes before returning to camera. Studio publicity carefully managed her image, ensuring publicity photos never showed her with cigarettes. Columbia chief Harry Cohn reportedly exploded when a photographer captured her lighting up. Nobody wants to fantasize about kissing an ashtray. Behind this manufactured purity lurked a woman who used cigarettes to manage crippling anxiety, often smoking until she made herself ill. The most heartbreaking chapter came as Hayworth began experiencing memory issues in her 40 seconds, symptoms of the early-onset Alzheimer's that would eventually be diagnosed. Doctors suspected her heavy smoking accelerated the disease's progression. Yet even as her memory failed, the physical habit remained. Caretakers reported that the confused star would light cigarettes and immediately forget them, causing multiple small fires in her final years. When Hayworth died in 1987, the glamorous legend had long since faded into a haze of smoke and forgotten glory. The woman once called the Love Goddess spent her final years unable to remember her own iconic films, while never forgetting the motion of bringing a cigarette to her lips. Number 7. Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball revolutionized television with I Love Lucy, creating a template for sitcoms that endures 7 decades later. Her rubber-faced physical comedy and impeccable timing made her America's most beloved redhead. Yet, behind the scenes, Ball maintained a 3-pack-a-day habit that she desperately hid from her family-friendly public image. Ball began smoking as a teenage model in the 1930s and continued throughout her rise from B-movie player to television pioneer. On the set of I Love Lucy, she created an elaborate system to feed her addiction while maintaining her wholesome image. Crew members reported designated smoking corners just off set where Ball would frantically puff between scenes, with production assistants tasked with giving her 2-minute warnings so she could finish before cameras rolled. Desi Arnaz, her husband and co-star, once revealed, Lucy had one face for the public and another face hidden in a cloud of smoke. The couple's infamous real-life arguments were frequently triggered by Ball's irritability when she couldn't smoke during long filming sessions. Their daughter later recalled Mom's smoking room in their Beverly Hills home, a space where Ball would retreat several times daily, often emerging with breath fresheners and perfume to mask the smell. The most striking contradiction was between Ball's carefully maintained public health and her private destruction. While filming pharmaceutical commercials advocating wellness, she was consuming upwards of 60 cigarettes daily. When CBS executives requested she quit for publicity reasons, Ball reportedly responded, "The day I stop smoking is the day I stop being funny. You choose." After her 1989 death from an aortic aneurysm, a condition exacerbated by decades of smoking, her children found hundreds of cigarette burns on the furniture in her home, the silent testimony to the addiction. America's comedy queen had kept hidden from the millions who welcomed her into their living rooms each week. Number 8. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner wasn't just beautiful. She was devastating. A force of nature whose raw sensuality in films like The Killers and The Barefoot Contessa made her Hollywood's ultimate femme fatale. Frank Sinatra, her third husband, called her the most beautiful animal in the world. But beneath that flawless exterior, Gardner was systematically destroying herself with a cigarette habit that began before her MGM contract and outlasted her film career. Gardner's relationship with tobacco was as intense as her legendary love affairs. She smoked unfiltered Lucky Strikes, the strongest commercial cigarettes available, consuming up to 4 packs on stressful shooting days. Her makeup artists fought a constant battle, covering the yellowing between her fingers. One recalled, "Ava's hands were always stained orange-brown. We'd cover it with foundation, but she'd wash it off to smoke between takes." What made her addiction particularly destructive was how it interacted with her other vices. Gardner was famously fond of whiskey, often washing down each cigarette with a swig of alcohol, creating a toxic cycle that accelerated the damage to her system. By her 40 seconds, her legendary voice had deepened to a rasp that directors increasingly found difficult to work around. The true tragedy emerged in the 1980 when Gardner suffered a stroke, leaving the once vital star partially paralyzed. Doctors attributed it directly to her decades of heavy smoking. Even this catastrophe wasn't enough to break her addiction. Confined to her London flat, she continued smoking through a holder she could manage with her still functional hand. When her final lover begged her to quit, she reportedly responded, "Darling, without cigarettes, what would be the point of continuing?" Gardner died in 1990, having survived longer than medical experts predicted, but the final photographs show a woman hollowed out by her vices, the legendary beauty transformed into a cautionary tale about addiction's power to consume even the most magnificent creatures. Number 9. Lana Turner. Lana Turner embodied Hollywood glamour, the sweater girl whose hourglass figure and platinum blonde perfection made her MGM's most reliable box office draw. From her discovery at Schwab's drugstore to her dramatic performances in The Postman Always Rings Twice and Peyton Place, Turner seemed to have it all. But beneath the carefully constructed image was a woman whose cigarette addiction fueled a chaotic personal life and eventually destroyed her legendary beauty. Turner's relationship with nicotine began at 15, and by the time she reached stardom, she was already consuming 2 packs daily. Studio publicity departments worked overtime, concealing her habit, airbrushing cigarettes from publicity photos and forbidding photographers from capturing her smoking. MGM chief Louis B. Mayer reportedly scolded her, "No one wants to see their dream girl with an ashtray mouth." Her addiction intensified during personal crises. When her daughter Cheryl Crane stabbed Turner's abusive boyfriend Johnny Stompanato in 1958, creating Hollywood's most explosive scandal, Turner reportedly smoked 6 consecutive packs during police questioning. Her 7 failed marriages coincided with escalating tobacco use, with one ex-husband claiming, "Lana loved cigarettes more consistently than any of her husbands." By the 1970s, smoking had ravaged the beauty that made her famous. Her famous voice developed a permanent rasp, and directors began shooting her through filters and soft focus to disguise the premature aging caused by decades of tobacco. When offered a cigarette cessation program in the early 1980s, Turner reportedly laughed, "Darling, I'm not giving up my oldest friend at this late date." The final insult came when throat cancer was diagnosed in 1992. The disease attacked the voice that had made her a star, leaving her unable to speak above a whisper in her final months. When Turner died in 1995, cigarettes had claimed yet another Hollywood legend, transforming a woman once considered the peak of physical perfection into a painful reminder of addiction's destructive power. Number 10. Claudette Colbert. Claudette Colbert projected sophistication and wit in classics like It Happened One Night and The Palm Beach Story. With her heart-shaped face and impeccable comic timing, she represented Hollywood elegance at its finest. Academy Award in hand, she ruled the box office in the 1930s and 1940s. What audiences never suspected was that Colbert maintained a 3-pack-a-day habit that began in her native France and continued throughout her 6-decade career. Colbert turned smoking into performance art, using cigarettes as sophisticated props in her comedies. In private, the habit was far less glamorous. Her personal assistant later revealed that Colbert often woke in the middle of the night to smoke, sometimes consuming half a pack before returning to sleep. Her famous insistence on being filmed only from her left side wasn't just vanity. It was strategic concealment of the more visible smoking damage on the right side of her face. Director Frank Capra once commented, "Claudette's cigarettes were her security blanket. Take them away, and she'd fall apart." This dependency became problematic during production of It Happened One Night, when her constant smoking irritated co-star Clark Gable's eyes, creating tension that paradoxically enhanced their on-screen chemistry. The most disturbing aspect of Colbert's addiction was her denial. Despite developing a chronic cough that occasionally disrupted filming, she maintained that European women could smoke without the health consequences Americans experienced. When doctors warned her of emphysema in the 1960s, she reportedly dismissed them as puritanical Americans who didn't understand the French relationship with pleasure. Colbert survived until 1996, reaching 92, despite her habit, but her final decades were marked by increasing breathing, difficulties that limited her mobility, and eventually confined her to her California home. The woman who once embodied effortless sophistication spent her final years tethered to an oxygen tank, a cruel irony for someone who had spent a lifetime blowing elegant smoke rings across silver screens worldwide. Number 11. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead wasn't just an actress. She was a force of nature whose outrageous personality often overshadowed her considerable talents. With her deep voice, theatrical flair, and devastating wit, she conquered Broadway before making her mark in Hollywood with films like Lifeboat and A Royal Scandal. But Bankhead's legendary voice, once described as deep cream with whiskey, was actually the product of her most destructive habit. Smoking up to 120 cigarettes daily for most of her adult life, Bankhead began smoking at 12, and by the time she reached fame in her 22nd, cigarettes had already permanently altered her vocal cords. Rather than hindering her career, this distinctive rasp became her trademark. Alfred Hitchcock once remarked, "Tallulah doesn't have a voice. She has an event." What audiences didn't realize was that this event was actually progressive damage that would eventually contribute to her demise. Her relationship with cigarettes was exhibitionist rather than furtive. While other actresses tried to hide their habit, Bankhead flaunted it, often conducting interviews through clouds of smoke. So thick photographers complained their lenses were fogging. During the filming of Lifeboat, crew members counted her lighting up 120 times in a single day, despite being confined to a water tank for the shoot. The most chilling aspect of Bankhead's addiction was her fatalistic embrace of its consequences. When warned by doctors that smoking was killing her, she famously quipped, "Don't talk to me about my bad habits. They're the only things keeping me alive." By her 60 seconds, What had begun as a sexy rasp had deteriorated into a painful croak that limited her acting opportunities to roles specifically written for damaged voices. When Bankhead died in 1968 from pneumonia complicated by emphysema, her lungs were so compromised that doctors marveled she had survived as long as she had. Her last words reportedly were a request for a cigarette, denied by her nurses. Thus ended one of Hollywood's most flamboyant lives, extinguished by the very habit that had helped craft her unforgettable persona. Number 12. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo was mystery incarnate. With her luminous performances in classics like Queen Christina and Ninotchka, she created an aura of unattainable perfection before vanishing from public view at the height of her fame. For decades after her retirement, the public obsessed over Garbo sightings, seeking glimpses of the most beautiful woman ever captured on film. What they didn't know was that behind her carefully maintained veil of privacy, Garbo nursed a cigarette addiction that began during her poverty-stricken childhood in Sweden. Garbo's relationship with smoking was as complex as the woman herself. Unlike other stars who flaunted cigarettes as fashion accessories, she treated hers as a guilty secret, smoking only in private and refusing to be photographed with cigarettes. This wasn't just image management, it reflected her genuine conflict over a habit she simultaneously craved and despised. On film sets, Garbo insisted on absolute privacy for her smoking breaks, often refusing to emerge from her dressing room for hours while chain-smoking through anxiety attacks. Director George Cukor once recalled, "Garbo didn't just smoke cigarettes. She devoured them, as though trying to consume something essential she couldn't find elsewhere." Her famous line, "I want to be alone," took on new meaning when crew members revealed she often said it when seeking smoking opportunities between scenes. The great contradiction in Garbo's life was between her legendary beauty and her self-destructive habit. The woman whose face inspired poetry maintained a two-pack daily habit that progressively damaged her appearance. When photographers captured rare images of the aging Garbo walking in New York, they revealed a woman whose once perfect features showed the telltale signs of long-term nicotine exposure. Garbo died in 1990, having spent more years in reclusive retirement than in active film work. An autopsy revealed lungs severely damaged by 6 decades of smoking, suggesting that the divine Garbo, like so many of her contemporaries, had been rendered all too human by addiction's devastating power. Number 13. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake exploded into 1940 Hollywood with her trademark peek-a-boo hairstyle and hypnotic presence in noir classics like This Gun for Hire and The Blue Dahlia. With her petite 40 frame and curtain of blonde hair falling over one eye, she created an instantly recognizable image that women across America rushed to imitate. But the sultry coolness Lake projected on screen masked a woman desperately self-medicating with cigarettes and alcohol. Lake began smoking as a teenager to combat anxiety, a condition that would plague her throughout her troubled life. By her early 22nd, at the height of her fame, she was consuming 3 to 4 packs daily, often chain-smoking through night shoots on her noir films. Co-star Alan Ladd, himself a smoker, once complained, "Working with Veronica is like filming in a forest fire. You can barely see her through the smoke." What made Lake's addiction particularly destructive was how it interacted with her deteriorating mental health and alcoholism. As her star began to fade in the late 1940s, her smoking increased proportionally to her career disappointments. Studio makeup artists noted alarming premature aging, with one remarking, "She's 29 going on 50, all because of those damn cigarettes." The most heartbreaking chapter came after her fall from stardom. In the 1960s, a reporter discovered the once glamorous Lake working as a barmaid in New York, so changed by alcohol and cigarettes that customers didn't recognize the former star serving their drinks. Her once porcelain complexion had coarsened, and her famous voice had dropped to a gravelly register that made her almost unrecognizable. When Lake died in 1973 at just 50, the official cause was hepatitis, but doctors noted that her smoking had significantly worsened her condition. The woman whose image once graced magazine covers worldwide ended her life in obscurity, her iconic beauty having literally gone up in smoke. Perhaps the cruelest irony? In her most famous films, cigarette smoke often created the atmospheric fog through which her haunting face emerged, the very substance that would eventually erase that beauty forever. Number 14. Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck wasn't just talented. She was indestructible, rising from orphanage poverty to become Hollywood's highest-paid woman in the 1940s. With her no-nonsense attitude and remarkable range in classics like Double Indemnity and The Lady Eve, Stanwyck represented toughness incarnate. Yet, this symbol of resilience harbored a weakness that would ultimately prove fatal: a 7-decade addiction to unfiltered cigarettes. Stanwyck's affair with tobacco began at age 9 inches Brooklyn, where she smoked discarded butts scavenged from gutters. By the time she conquered Hollywood, smoking had become her constant companion, a habit so ingrained that directors incorporated it into her characters. Her famous drag in Double Indemnity wasn't acting. It was authentic addiction captured on film. Director Billy Wilder once remarked, "Barbara doesn't play characters who smoke. She's a smoker who occasionally plays characters." What made Stanwyck's case unusual was her complete transparency about her habit. While other actresses hid their smoking, she flaunted it, once telling an interviewer, "I smoke, I drink, I stay up late, and I don't exercise. I do everything they tell you not to do." This defiance became part of her brand, the tough girl who played by her own rules both on and off screen. The price of this defiance became apparent in her later years when emphysema and chronic bronchitis regularly hospitalized her. Even then, she reportedly sneaked cigarettes in the bathroom of her hospital room. When doctors implored her to quit, she allegedly responded, "I've survived an abusive childhood, the Depression, and 4 Hollywood marriages. If cigarettes want to kill me, they'll have to work harder than that." When Stanwyck died in 1990 at 82, her lungs were so severely damaged that doctors marveled she had remained active into her late 70s. The woman who had overcome every obstacle life threw at her had finally met the one opponent she couldn't beat with sheer willpower. Her legendary toughness had met its match in nicotine's unrelenting grip. Number 15. Ingrid Bergman. Ingrid Bergman embodied wholesomeness on screen. With her natural beauty and luminous presence in classics like Casablanca and Notorious, she projected an aura of purity that captivated audiences worldwide. When her affair with director Roberto Rossellini scandalized Hollywood in 1950, Americans felt personally betrayed by the woman they had idealized. But this public scandal masked a more private betrayal of Bergman's health, a concealed 3-pack-a-day habit that began in her native Sweden and continued throughout her illustrious career. Bergman's relationship with cigarettes was deliberately hidden from her public. Studio contracts specifically prohibited photographers from capturing her smoking, and publicity departments crafted an image of Scandinavian wholesomeness that excluded her tobacco dependency. When fans discovered her affair with Rossellini, they were outraged. Had they known about her smoking, which was considered even more inappropriate for women in the 1940s, the backlash might have come years earlier. Director Alfred Hitchcock, who worked closely with Bergman on 3 films, later revealed, Ingrid was constantly disappearing between takes for fresh air, which actually meant chain smoking, where cameras couldn't catch her. This deception created shooting delays that frustrated crews, but protected her carefully constructed image. The cruelest irony came in 1974, when Bergman discovered a lump while appearing in a London play. Initially dismissing it, she delayed seeking treatment, continuing to smoke heavily despite growing concern. The diagnosis was devastating: breast cancer. possibly exacerbated by decades of smoking. Even then, she kept her habit secret from all but her closest confidants. When Bergman died in 1982 on her 67th birthday, obituaries celebrated her triumphant return from scandal to acclaim. None mentioned that the woman whose smile once lit up Casablanca had spent her final years battling cancer while still unable to break her nicotine dependency. The public never knew that their natural beauty had been anything but natural in her relationship with cigarettes. Number 16. Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow blazed through Hollywood like a comet, redefining sexuality on screen with her platinum blonde hair and uninhibited performances in pre-code films like Red Dust and Bombshell. With her knowing eyes and breathless voice, she created a template for screen sirens that endures nearly a century later. What few realized was that Harlow's meteoric rise and tragic early death were both accelerated by a cigarette habit that began when she was barely a teenager. Harlow's introduction to smoking came through her domineering mother, who believed cigarettes would keep her daughter's weight in check for the camera. By age 15, Harlow was smoking regularly, and by the height of her fame in the early 1930s, she consumed upwards of 40 cigarettes daily. On set, she was notorious for smoking between takes and immediately after romantic scenes, much to the frustration of co-stars like Clark Gable, who complained about the taste of tobacco during their kisses. What made Harlow's smoking particularly dangerous was how it interacted with her already fragile health. Chronically ill from childhood, she suffered from influenza, polio scares, and numerous infections. Doctors later concluded that her heavy smoking suppressed her immune system, making each illness more severe than it might otherwise have been. The most heartbreaking aspect of Harlow's story is how cigarettes contributed to masking her final illness. When she became fatally ill with kidney failure in 1937, her persistent smoker's cough disguised more serious symptoms until it was too late. By the time she was hospitalized, her condition was irreversible. Studio publicists worked overtime, concealing both her critical condition and her history of heavy smoking from a public that had embraced her as the ultimate symbol of vitality and sensuality. When Harlow died at just 26, Hollywood lost its original platinum blonde. While kidney disease was the official cause, medical experts later concluded that years of heavy smoking had significantly compromised her already vulnerable system. The bombshell, whose image suggested unquenchable life, had been extinguished far too soon, partly by the very habit that had become inseparable from her glamorous persona. Number 17. Deborah Kerr. Deborah Kerr epitomized sophistication on screen. With her refined beauty and impeccable poise in classics like From Here to Eternity and The King and I, she created an image of perfect British dignity that earned her 6 Academy Award nominations. Behind this polished exterior lurked a secret. Kerr maintained a 2-pack daily habit that began during World War II when cigarettes were standard issue to entertainers visiting troops. Unlike more flamboyant stars, Kerr treated her addiction as a private shame, smoking only in seclusion and maintaining a public image of health-conscious propriety. This wasn't mere image management. It reflected her genuine conflict over a habit she recognized as destructive yet couldn't abandon. Director Otto Preminger once noted, "Deborah would emerge from her dressing room perfectly composed, not a hair out of place, but if you looked closely, you'd see tiny burns on her costumes from the cigarettes she'd been frantically smoking moments before." The famous beach scene in From Here to Eternity, where Kerr and Burt Lancaster embraced in the mer surf, required multiple takes because Kerr was suffering from a persistent smoker's cough she couldn't control once submerged in water. Lancaster later recalled, "Between those passionate kisses, she was struggling not to cough in my face. It wasn't romance, it was nicotine withdrawal." What made Kerr's case particularly poignant was her conscious effort to shield her children from her habit. She never smoked in their presence and attempted to quit during each of her pregnancies, only to resume afterward with increased intensity. Her daughter later revealed finding cigarette butts hidden in potted plants around their home, evidence of Kerr's attempt to conceal her addiction from those she loved most. When Kerr died in 2007 after battling Parkinson's disease, her family acknowledged that decades of smoking had complicated her condition and treatment options. The woman who projected perfect control on screen had been controlled throughout her life by an addiction she never fully acknowledged publicly. A final private battle for an actress who always valued dignity above disclosure. Number 18. Mae West. Mae West didn't just push boundaries. She obliterated them. With her sexual innuendos and unapologetic sensuality in films like She Done Him Wrong and I'm No Angel, she scandalized and delighted Depression-era audiences in equal measure. Her famous invitation, "Come up and see me sometime," became a cultural catchphrase. What fans didn't realize was that the room they were being invited to was likely filled with cigarette smoke from West's 7-decade habit. West began smoking in vaudeville as a teenager, drawn to cigarettes as symbols of sophistication and rebellion. By her Hollywood heyday in the 1930s, she was consuming up to 60 cigarettes daily, often using a trademark holder that became part of her vampish image. Unlike contemporaries who tried to conceal their habit, West incorporated smoking into her provocative persona, using it to punctuate her double entendres on screen. What made West's addiction particularly remarkable was its longevity. She maintained her heavy smoking well into her 80 seconds, defying medical advice with the same bravado she had once defied censors. When doctors warned that cigarettes were destroying her famous voice, she reportedly quipped, "I've been smoking since before you were born, doctor. If it was going to kill me, I'd be dead already." The most surreal chapter in West's smoking history came during her comeback in 1970 Myra Breckinridge, when the 7-year-old star insisted on smoking throughout filming, despite developing a chronic cough that disrupted production. Director Michael Sarn later revealed, Mae would refuse to put out her cigarette even when the coughing fits left, her gasping for breath. She said, "The cigarette is part of my character, honey, and I'm not breaking character for anyone." When West died in 1987 at 87, medical examiners were astonished by the condition of her lungs, which showed damage typically seen in industrial workers exposed to airborne toxins. The woman who had built a career on innuendo had maintained one relationship longer than any other, not with any of her many lovers, but with the cigarettes that had been her constant companions for over 75 years. Hollywood glamorized smoking for generations, transforming a deadly addiction into a symbol of sophistication. These legendary actresses paid the ultimate price, sacrificing their health for an image that ultimately consumed them. But here's the uncomfortable question. Were these stars victims of the industry, or willing participants in their own destruction? Did Hollywood push cigarettes on its stars, or did actresses choose their poison to cope with the crushing pressures of fame? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below.